This is the complete compilation of all Hells Angels Denmark's 4 wars, through their 43 years' existence.
Dette er dansk rockerhistorie med Magnus.
Between the years 1977 and 1988, the first part of the Great Biker War between members of Hells Angels MC and Bullshit MC was fought in Denmark. It caused 12 people to die and made Hells Angels Denmark the leading motorcycle club in Scandinavia. This was the first biker war in Scandinavia, a war that would later evolve into the war between Hells Angels and Bandidos, in what has been dubbed the Great Nordic Biker War.
Den første danske rockerkrig.
The Nordic biker culture emerged in Sweden with the establishment of numerous motorcycle clubs in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In the 70s there were also biker gangs in Copenhagen, but they were not very well organized and often brawled with each other. In Danish they were called rockere. These groups were inspired by the British rocker subculture, and Danish clubs became increasingly influenced by developments in the United States and began to refer to themselves as bikers. The term rocker is still commonly used by the police and media in Denmark to refer to what they call the outlaw motorcycle subculture, or the 1%ers. The group Rotter, or Roots from Vestmager, formed in the late 70s the Norgersmine gang, which together with the Vesterbro group Filthy Few, became Bullshit MC in the late 70s. At about the same time, the motorcycle clubs Galloping Goose, Dirty Angels, Nomads and Iron Skulls merged to form the Union, who later would become the first Hells Angels chapter in Scandinavia. A conflict between the two rivaling clubs were now imminent.
Altså, jeg har haft nogle diskussioner med da jeg var yngre med mine forældre, på et tidspunkt, hvor de har sagt, hvis du har den attitude, så rører du i fængsel, når du bliver stor, ikke? Og så sagde jeg, så tager jeg også bare det. Det har jeg været ude for, da jeg var 16-17 år. Så det har ikke været sådan helt uventet, men det har jeg taget med.
The Union's first meeting with the Hells Angels was when one of their motorcycles broke down when traveling in Europe. They got help to fix their motorcycle from a Hells Angel chapter nearby, and this became the seed that started Hells Angels in the Nordic countries.
4 Mercedes-biler med en gruppe tyskere er på vej fra Hamburg til København. De er alle medlemmer af Hells Angels internationale broderskab og skal undersøge, om der er grundlag for en afdeling i Danmark. I 1978 har 4 af de stærkeste danske rockergrupper sluttet sig sammen for at blive Hells Angels. Danskerne har forberedt et stort party for de tyske engle. Det udvikler sig i løbet af aftenen til et slagsmål i klubhuset. Men næste morgen tager tyskerne afsted igen med hilsenen "See you motherfuckers", og 2 år senere er danskerne blevet optaget som Hells Angels.
And the Union MC now became Hells Angel Prospects. While being prospects of Hells Angels, a member of the former Union MC, now MC Denmark Prospect Club, was kicked to death by his biker brothers.
I 1979 falder rockeren Søren Langballe i unåde hos klubben i Titangade og bliver udstødt, da de andre i gruppen er på vej til at blive fuldgyldige medlemmer af Hells Angels internationale broderskab.
Den type person, som ham Søren var, Søren Hul i Hår hedder jeg vil sige, han var så farlig, så jeg tror ikke bare, den mand tror jeg ikke bare, man kunne have givet en almindelig røvfuld, hvis den var. Altså, det foregik til en fest, hvor folk var fulde i forvejen, ikke? Og når folk er fulde, ikke, så kan ting udvikle sig, og så var der nogen, der ville give dem en røvfuld, og den tog så overhånd. Og det er så endte som, at han blev slået ihjel. Han er blevet tævet ihjel.
Fra klubhuset i Titangade bliver den lemlæstede Søren Langballe slæbt ind i en baggård på Vesterbro. Han bliver efterladt, og der ringes til alarmcentralen, men nogen tager fejl af adressen, og om morgenen bliver han fundet død.
Altså, jeg var ikke stolt ved den situation. Men det er sket, og selvom det ikke har været godt, så er det alligevel på en eller anden måde, har det været med til, hvor vi er i dag, ikke?
In 1979, the members of some of the rival gangs now merged and formed their own club, Bullshit MC, to oppose their rival, the Union's dominance. Bullshit settled in Copenhagen's Christiania, a small neighborhood where hashish were openly sold, and soon took control of the cannabis business there. A conflict between the two dominant biker clubs in Denmark now seemed inevitable, and this was the beginning of the First Danish Biker War. The first death in this war had happened already in 1977 when Kim Mortensen, a 24-year-old, became the first to die in the conflict. As a member of the Nordic Mind gang, later Bullshit MC, he was shot during the group's ambush of the nomads at a pier in Copenhagen. The killing was ruled as self-defense by the court, and the charge against the nomads member Gubi was dropped. It would only take 6 more days before the second death happened. This time it was Kim Mortensen's friend, Johnny Jensen, who was shot and killed. Lars Welling, who had connections to the Union gang, was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the murder and earns the brand Filthy Few on his vest when he becomes a member of Hells Angels later. On the night of September 24, 1983, at 3:15, 3 Bullshit members and a friend entered the restaurant Soppermeniden in Osterbro. It was Steen Gerbo Grander and Flemming Hold Jensen who first entered the restaurant. This restaurant was in Hells Angel territory, and the 3 Bullshit members were attacked by 4 Hells Angels members with knives and bottles, killing Grander and Jensen, while the third, Michael Peter Enoch, was seriously injured. The criminal police investigated the double murder, and several members of Hells Angels were arrested, including the suspected killer, Bent Svein Nielsen. On September 21, 1984, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the double murder. Henrik Cruz Jensen was sentenced to 5 years in prison, while Hungsi Hansen was sentenced to 4 years for complicity in the killings. After this, there were multiple shootings between the two clubs. After one of the shootings, this time against Hells Angels headquarters, the president of Bullshit, nicknamed Mackerel, had been pointed out as the perpetrator behind the shooting.
Bullshit provokerer ved flere lejligheder Hells Angels og skyder ind i deres klubhus.
Carlo står op på altanen ved vores klubhus, hvor de kommer kørende forbi om natten, og Carlo skyder i øvrigt igen. Og der er vi ikke helt sikre. Han mener, det er makrellen, Carlo. Men så får vi nogle efterretninger en uge efter af en pige, som kender nogen derude. Og hun fortæller, at det var makrellen, der var forbi.
Hells Angels now decided to target the president of Bullshit himself, and Jynke offered to be the assassin.
Og jeg beslutter mig sådan set til, at det skal være mig, fordi jeg er ung og har tiden for mig. Altså, der er ligesom lys for enden af tunnelen, hvis man ryger i spillet, ikke? Og jeg havde ingen kone, og jeg havde ingen børn på det tidspunkt. Jeg havde en pige, ikke, som løs forhold. Det var jeg. Hvorimod nogle af de andre medlemmer havde kone og børn. Og så synes jeg, så ville jeg være ham der.
He hid in a van close to the home of Mackerel. When the president came out of his home with his girlfriend, he sprang into action.
Jeg sender en salve på 5-6 skud hen mod midten af vognen, og jeg mener, jeg rammer ham. Han ryger i hvert fald. Og så løber jeg rundt omkring døren, og der hænger han halvvejs ud af døren, og der tømmer jeg maskinpistolen i ham. Og han er død. Og det er meget brutalt, men sådan slår man folk ihjel.
The president of Bullshit MC is dead.
Jynke
now flees and spends 2 years in Canada before returning to Denmark, where he was sentenced to 16 years in jail.
Det er ikke helt med min gode vilje, vel, men jeg kan godt se rimeligheden i, at jeg har fået 16 år for at slå ihjel. Det kan jeg godt se rimeligheden i, fordi der er nødt til at være en vis orden. Ellers så bliver det hele et stort kaos. Så jeg brokker mig ikke over, at jeg har fået 16 år.
Bullshit now elects anchor Walter Marcus, nicknamed Hovding, as their new president. But the new president wouldn't be alive for very long. The 38-year-old president met his fate at the Christiania pub, Nemo, 3 days before Christmas Eve in 1985. He was killed by 8 bullets.
Ludvig har aldrig tilstået mordet på bullshitteren Høvding, der blev dræbt en tidlig morgen på Christiania på værtshuset Nemo.
Ja, en ting, der ligger fast, det var, at det var Høvding blev skudt. Ja, jeg mener, at hvis der var nogen nede for os, som der havde skudt eller dræbt høvden, så havde de en meget god grund til det. For det kunne lige så godt have været nogen fra Bagship, der var blevet dræbt meget før. Og så er jeg glad for, at det var dem, der stillede skoene, og ikke os.
A local man was also killed in the shooting, shot through his mouth. The shooting happened in Christiania, a neighborhood that was considered bullshit territory, a shooting the Danish media dubbed an execution. According to the people questioned by the police after the shooting, the Hells Angel prospects were the only one that shot. The police became interested in the MC club, Black Sheep, after the shooting, a group that at the time were Hells Angel prospects, and later became full members and the second Hells Angel chapter in Denmark. The police arrested René Notteskov Ludvigsen and Ole Bonnesen Nielsen, with the nicknames Ludvig and Oost, both members of the MC club Black Sheep. They have always claimed they shot in self-defense. In 1986, both were convicted and sentenced to 16 years in prison. But the mysterious third man involved was never named or arrested by the police. In 2002, in the Danish newspaper
Ekstra Bladet,
revealed the name of the third man involved, Dan Ling. In the interview, he confirms that he was involved and gave his version of the event. He says, "We had patrolled around the city to find out if bullshit was up to something. As prospects, we were responsible for the safety when Hells Angels held a 5-year anniversary celebration a week later. In the middle of the night, we ended up at Christiania, where we stopped to listen to some gossip. Suddenly, 3 bullshit members walked in the door. According to Dan Ling, one bullshit member sat cross-legged on a chair near Oost, while the others gathered at the bar, near a table with some people we didn't know who were. It was Oost that shot out of his pocket when the guy on the chair pulled a weapon, and Hovding had drawn his pistol, but Oost was quicker. Provo Canute also pulled his pistol and pointed it at the head of Ludvig, but it clicked and didn't fire. After that, Oost and Ludvig emptied their magazines. They hit Hovding and the young guy who had drawn a knife. It all happened very spontaneously, it was not an assassination." He continues, when it was later established that the bullshit members were unarmed, it must be because they had time to remove the evidence before the police arrived. Both Hovding and Provo Canute were armed, and they were the first who pulled their guns. This is Dan Ling's version of the double murders in Christiania, a version he says he gave to his contact person at the police, Tony Christensen, already in the spring of 1991. "I'm the unknown third person from Christiania. I told this myself to the police in 1991, but they would not prosecute me. Instead the police recruited him as a police agent." The article where he is interviewed is in the description below, but unfortunately only in Danish. Later that year, the Hells Angel member, Hindholm, Michael Nikolai Nielsen dies, after being shot in the throat by bullshit member Peter Panic Espensen at the Copenhagen restaurant Rio Bravo. Panic Peter was acquitted of manslaughter and freed under the law on self-defense, because according to the court, he shot in fear and agitation over Hells Angels' previous murder on a bullshit member, meaning Hovding. In 1986, Jan Sundberg, another member of Bullshit, was killed in front of the Bullshit clubhouse. He was assassinated by Nick Jacobson with the nickname Lærling, apprentice, who later became a member of Hells Angels. He was sentenced to life in prison, which usually was between 16 and 18 years in Denmark at the time. The year after, the Bullshit member Paul Blabjerg, Lillebror, was gunned down at work, while delivering beer to a shop in Valby. A member of the Hells Angels support group the Morticians, Karsten Breslov, was sentenced to 16 years in jail for the murder. The same year, Niels Åge Albrecht, a 28-year-old man, disappeared without a trace. 10 months later, the police found his body cast in the concrete floor of Bullshit's clubhouse in Christiania. He had been shot dead in the house, when Panic Peter had fired his weapon, according to him, by accident. A total of 9 people were convicted of complicity. On July 1, 1988, the last president of Bullshit MC, Jan Krolinde, called Hells Angels headquarters at Titan Street and said, "We have sold the clubhouse and burned our vests." The war is over. The war between the two clubs ended with 12 people losing their lives, 8 from bullshit, 3 whom were presidents, 1 from Hell's Angels, as well as 3 people who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hell's Angels in Denmark has the record of the most murders by any Hell's Angels chapter in Europe.
I Danmark er vi nok lidt mere belastet, end vi er andre steder omkring i Europa, men det er ikke nogen fordel at gøre noget kriminelt for at blive medlem af Hell's Angels. Tværtimod, hvad vi er med en person, vil jeg hellere have folk, der rent straffetøst.
Så længe at, jeg tror det er 7 af dem, der sidder fængslet for drab, det er 3 for dobbeltdrab, 5 for drabsforsøg, 2 for vold med døden til følge, 50 for andre voldsforbrydelser. Altså 50 tilfælde af voldsforbrydelser findes der derudover, plus en masse sager med narkohandel osv. Så må man jo sige, at medlemmerne af denne forening selv har givet anledning til den omtale.
Hell's Angels now started to establish their dominance in the Nordic countries and subsequently expanded into Norway, opening a chapter in Trondheim in August 1992, followed by Sweden's first chapter in 1993, and then in Finland not long after that. Bandidos were established on the European continent via the chapter in Marseille, on September 20, 1989. After violent encounters between the French Bandidos and Hell's Angels, American executives from both clubs met in Paris in the late summer of 1993 and signed a non-aggression pact in order to avoid police and government countermeasures that could prevent their expansion. But the peace wouldn't last very long. The Undertakers MC, a club in Denmark formerly on good terms with the Hell's Angels before disputes led to a strain in relations, applied for membership in the Bandidos from the club's leadership in the United States and France in 1992, and was patched over by the Bandidos in December 1993, becoming the first Bandidos chapter in the Nordic countries. They were soon followed by Bandidos chapters in Sweden in 1994 and Finland and Norway in 1995. An arms race between the two clubs now started and both clubs spread and got several chapters across the Nordic countries. Other MC clubs also got involved, among them, Outlaws MC, who established a chapter in Oslo, Norway in 1994 and declared their allegiance to Bandidos. I'm not going to mention everyone, every club and everything that happened in the war, because that would be a very long presentation, but I'm going to focus on the events that had the most impact. The first shots fired in the conflict came shortly after the Morbits MC in Helsingborg became a probationary Bandidos chapter in 1994. Members of the Hell's Angels Prospect Club, Rebels MC, strafed the club's headquarters with gunfire, and later became a Hell's Angels chapter in Helsingborg, Sweden. The conflict soon escalated with many incidences between the two clubs and their supporters. The war quickly revealed the differences in the strategies of the opposing sides. According to MC Club commentators and journalists, the Bandidos attacks were seemingly indiscriminate, whereas the Hell's Angels were more strategic, targeting their rivals' leadership. The first death in this war happened on February 13, 1994, when 15 Danish Bandidos members were ambushed by Hell's Angels associates at a Helsingborg nightclub, resulting in 13 gunshots being fired, and Joachim Bowman, a member of a Hell's Angels support club, being shot dead. The murder has never been solved. On July 17, 1995, Bandidos' Swedish President Michael Joel Ljunggren was shot dead with a rifle while riding his motorcycle. The Choppers MC in Stockholm gained prospect status from the Hell's Angels shortly after the killing, leading to a theory that the Choppers carried out the assassination of Ljunggren on orders from Hell's Angels. Bandidos launched 2 attacks against Hell's Angels in retaliation. On July 25, 1995, 2 Undertakers members fired a rocket-propelled grenade at the Overkill clubhouse in northern Helsinki. The missile penetrated the building's walls but failed to explode on impact. An identical strike was carried out by Bandidos against the rebels' headquarters in Haslarp on July 31, 1995, again resulting in no injuries. Dan Ling, a former member of Hell's Angels, turned police agent and then becoming a Bandidos member, still being a police agent, carried out surveillance on the compound with a Swedish Bandidos prospect in the days before the attack. When Bandidos later found out he was a police agent, they posted his home address on the internet, and he now lives in witness protection program.
På 90-tallet så var det helt jævlig å være med i klubb. Det var ikke noe moro. Ikke kunne vi kjøre sykkel, ikke kunne vi kjøre med vestene våre. Det var redd for å bli skutt. Politiet var overalt hele tiden. Det var en konflikt som jeg håper vi ikke får oppleve en gang til.
In 1994, there were 2 murders connected to the war, one in Finland when the president of the Hells Angels support club Bandidos MC was fatally shot outside a restaurant in Finland. The other happened when a Morbits member killed a fellow inmate at Helsingborg prison for providing information to the police. In 1996, 8 bikers were shot in 4 different Nordic countries, in just over a week in March, resulting in 2 deaths. An Undertaker's member and prospect were shot after confronting overkill bikers, carrying out reconnaissance on their clubhouse. Jarkko Koko died from his wounds, but the prospect survived the attack. A few days later, Hells Angels carried out a twin attack on Bandidos members at Copenhagen Airport and Oslo Airport. Members of both clubs were attending events in Helsinki and found themselves on the same flights as they returned to their respective cities in Denmark and Norway. Hells Angels laid 2 ambushes and attacked Bandidos at both airports. At Copenhagen, 2 Bandidos members were attacked, resulting in the death of Afi Larsen. Bandidos Norway president Lars Harms was wounded in the shooting at Oslo Airport. The airport shootings marked the beginning of the most violent phase of the Nordic biker war, involving bombs, hand grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, car bombs and many shooting incidences. On July 15, 1996, some members of Bandidos, 2 from the Drammen chapter, and 2 from the visiting Helsingborg chapter, were involved in a brawl with members of the Customizers in central Oslo. Later that evening, the 4 Bandidos members were ambushed north of Mjøndalen. Helsingborg Bandidos prospect Jan Face Jensen died after being struck in the head with a bullet. Police believe that Michael Lurk Olsen, to whom Jan Jensen was serving as a bodyguard, was the intended target of the shooting. In 1997, Hells Angels member Kim Svensson was shot and killed, while driving in Aalborg, Denmark, when 3 rounds were fired at his car. The same year, 4 other members of Bandidos were shot outside a restaurant in Denmark. Bjørn Gudmandsen was killed and 3 others were wounded. During the most violent period of the war, in 1996 to 1997, 138 people were sentenced to a total of 240 years in prison, as a result of this period of the conflict alone. The biker war reached its crescendo on October 6, 1996, when the Copenhagen Hells Angels chapter's annual Viking party was attacked with a rocket-propelled grenade. The missile exploded after penetrating the building's concrete walls, killing 2 people, Hells Angels prospect Louis Nielsen and Jonna Krohn, a single mother from the local area, who accepted an invitation to the event, and wounding 19 others. Jonna Krohn was the first non-combatant killed as a result of the conflict, and the resulting public outrage caused the Danish government to introduce harsher anti-crime legislation in an effort to reduce motorcycle gang violence. A bill known as the Rocker Act passed on October 15, 1996, to allow the police to evict bikers from their clubhouses. Bandidos member Mickey Larsen was arrested on October 24, 1996 after his fingerprints was found on a machine gun that had been thrown away. Larsen was charged with 2 attacks carried out during the Nordic biker war, the attempted murder of Hells Angels member Jorn Nielsen, who was targeted with a machine gun in his cell at Jyderup State Prison, and a rocket attack on the Hells Angels clubhouse. However, after a time in custody, he was released and both charges were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Another Bandidos member, Niels Poulsen, was convicted of carrying out the rocket attack. On July 1, 1999, Larsen shot from his BMW at another motorist, who had his 9-year-old daughter in the car, in a road rage incident. Larsen drew a revolver and fired through the motorist's left front door. None of the occupants of the car were hit. He was taken into custody, but fled the city court while sitting in a private room with his defender Peter Jorn. He was arrested 10 days later while attempting to flee to Brazil. He later rebelled against the club's leadership after the murder of Claus Hansen, a close friend of Larsen, who was shot and killed by Bandidos members. Larsen was subsequently killed by a car bomb in 2003. Norway, June 3, 1997. John Berg, a member of the MC Club Screwdrivers, a Hells Angels prospect club, is driving a red Volkswagen transporter from Hamar to the sleepy town of Drammen, along a road where there were no surveillance cameras. The next evening John Berg, dressed in a black wig and clothes he could dispose of, drives the transporter down the quiet street of Conrad Street in Drammen. The car is loaded with a bomb weighing between 30 and 50 kilos. He parks it in front of the entranceway of the Bandidos clubhouse in Drammen and lights the bomb's fuse. Berg now uses a bicycle that was attached to the car to flee the scene and meets Kaimo Zether, who serves as a getaway driver and gets him out of the city. The bomb detonates at 11:44 p.m. The explosion was more powerful than planned, and the shock waves could be felt 600 meters away from the explosion site, severely damaging nearby buildings, including the Drammen ice cream factory. A few minutes later, a news reporter from NRK Radio is at the site of the bombing, when a second explosion happens.
Her NRK Dagsnytt ved midnatt. Bandidos hovedkvarter i Drammen sprengt i lufta for ca. et kvarter siden. Frank Barth-Nielsen fra NRK Buskerud, du på stedet, og hvordan ser det ut der nå?
Ja, tjukk røyk kommer opp fra bygningen og sviver over hele kvartalet her. Hele Bandidos hovedkvarter bare blitt en plankehaug, og den står i lys. Mer enn det vet jeg faktisk ikke, men det brenner voldsomt, og det voldsomt mye røyk, og det var og der smeller det igjen! Nok en eksplosjon i nybyen her. Jeg må flytte meg lenger unna, for dette her kjente jeg faktisk lufttrykket. Det bare vellet innom, og folk rømmer nå åstedet, og det tydelig at det ikke noe tvil om at dette en eksplosjon. Hva det skyldes, det kan ikke jeg si, men at det kraftig og at det dramatisk, det kan jeg slå fast.
The Norwegian king and queen were among those who listened to the radio broadcast when the second explosion happened. I did not think this could be in Norway. It was completely unreal, King Harald told TV2. Queen Sonja added, I heard it on the radio and then another explosion happened while the reporter was standing there. I jumped as high as the reporter did. It made a great impression. The 3 Bandidos members inside the building survived with minor injuries, but Irene Bekkevold, a 51-year-old woman, who was driving past the scene in her car, was killed in the explosion, and a total of 22 people were transported to hospital. Bekkevold's husband, who was a passenger in her vehicle, was among the wounded. At Drammen Hospital, a full emergency alert was announced and disaster preparedness was established, the first time in history such measures had been necessary at the hospital. The Prime Minister of Norway, Thorbjørn Jagland, and Justice Minister, Gerd Liv Valla, attended the scene of the bombing the following day. Completely shocked, the Prime Minister told the reporters present, "These people are inhuman. These satanic murderers must be caught, and they must be punished according to the law." Jagland vowed to propose legislation banning motorcycle gangs from establishing clubhouses in populated areas, and also threatened to propose legislation that would ban MC clubs from wearing their colors in public. Irene Bekkevold became the 10th person and the second innocent bystander to be killed as a result of the Great Nordic Biker War, but she would not be the last to die in the conflict. But the bombing in Norway was also the beginning of the end of the Great Nordic Biker War. Not long after the bomb in Drammen, Screwdrivers MC were patched over and became Hells Angels. The main target of the bomb was believed to be Michael Lerk Olsen, one of the founding members of Hells Angels Copenhagen, now a member of Bandidos. Along with the bombing in Drammen, killing a civilian woman, there was a public outroar in Scandinavia, turning the public and the politicians against the clubs and their supporters, and introducing new stricter laws, as well as intense scrutiny from politicians and law enforcement. A lawyer was hired to negotiate a peace treaty between the two clubs. A treaty designating each club's territory, right down to individual bars, cafes and nightclubs, was signed. Hells Angels Bent Svein Nielsen, and Bandidos Jim Tindon, held a live televised press conference on September 25, 1997 and announced an official end to hostilities. In 2017, a Norwegian NRK journalist called John Berg and asked him about the bombing attack he committed in Drammen 20 years earlier. To her surprise, he was willing to talk to her. It's very rare that members of biker clubs talk to journalists. The Hells Angels member says that he now lives off welfare money and suffers from post-traumatic stress syndrome because of what he did in 1997. Had I known that the area was so busy, I would never have done it. I later heard a bus passed by, a few seconds before the explosion. It could have been much worse. I'm terribly sorry. I want to give my unreserved apology to those I have affected, to those who lost a family member, and to those who lost quality of life. I'm not a victim in this, it's all the others who were affected who are victims. Before joining the motorcycle community, Berg served as a UN soldier in the Middle East and Bosnia. He says he was tired of walking around and being scared after returning home from Bosnia. It led me to do what I did in Drammen, he sighs. Do you regret it? The reporter asks. I live with it every day. After saying that, he doesn't want to talk anymore and hangs up the phone. 5 people were convicted of the bombing, or for assisting, and they got between 6 and 16 years in jail. John Berg, who lit the fuse on the bomb, only got 10 years in jail. Torkjell Alsaker, a Hells Angels president, were convicted to 16 years in jail, because although Alsaker was acquitted of the bombing itself, the court found it overwhelmingly probable that he had given the order for the attack. The Great Nordic Biker War resulted in 11 killings, 6 Bandidos members or associates, 3 Hells Angels members or associates, and 2 civilians, 74 attempted killings, and 96 people injured. Of those wounded, 40 were related to Hells Angels and 34 to Bandidos, while 22 were on-duty police officers or civilians. And unlike the first Danish biker war between Hells Angels and Bullshit, this war didn't have a clear winner, and in 2011, the peace deal between the two clubs
Når man er i krig med hinanden, som vi så i den store nordiske røverkrig, så er fokus for politi og myndighederne generelt jo skærpet endnu mere, end det var i forvejen. De har selv været med til at grave deres egen grav ved at være så synlige og så åbenlyse i deres voldelige handlinger og deres kriminalitet.
But the police were not the only ones that had gained on the biker war, because while the police had focused their efforts against Hells Angels and Bandidos, a new group had grown and gone almost undetected, namely the new immigrant gangs. Growing in size and dominance, these new gangs were beginners compared to the bikers, who now, according to biker journalists and police, started to look more and more like a club for old men. The war between Hells Angels and the immigrant gang brothers would change the power structure in the criminal underworld in Denmark, and signaling the beginning of the end of Hells Angels' dominance in Denmark. And it all started in an unlikely place, the free neighborhood Christiania, known for openly selling cannabis for decades in what was called Pusher Street. This small neighborhood was the center of cannabis sale in Copenhagen, with an estimated 90% of all cannabis dealings in the capital happening here. Bullshit MC had controlled this industry in the 80s, but after they were annihilated in the late 80s, the Angels took over this business. The police estimated that there was sold cannabis for between 1 and 3 million Danish crowns every day, but the government refused the police to do anything about it. This had been a point of frustration for the police, with millions of Danish crowns flowing through the illicit trade daily. But in 2003, when a new conservative government had come to power, law enforcement was given the go-ahead to close Christiania and Pusher Street for good. The police raided Christiania, apprehending over 60 people linked to the cannabis trade, and in one swoop, the police had demolished the biggest cannabis outlet in Denmark.
Det er jo nærmest, altså det er vel succesen med, at vi får fjernet pusherne, som udløser den der kamp om hasmarkedet. Så det var helt sikkert starten på, at indvandrerbanderne pressede sig ind på markedet. Personligt tror jeg, at det er at være med til at udløse bandekrigen i København.
What had previously been an almost monopoly on cannabis sales was now gone, and zealous heirs could now create their own fortune.
Jeg ville lyve, hvis jeg ville påstå, at jeg overhovedet ikke så op til rockermiljøerne. Jynke og Blondie og de drab, de foretog, var helt klart noget, som kørte i mit hoved.
The void left gave rise to an unexpected power shift in the criminal underworld.
Hele bandemiljøet, det var ligesom en ny start, en ny æra i den kriminelle underverden, parallelt med rockermiljøet.
As the immigrant gangs seized a golden opportunity to get in on the cannabis sales, and with this audacious move against the Angels' dominance, ignited the first spark in the coming gang war between the two groups. The new street gangs were young, innovative, hungry, and seized upon this opportunity. Among the players in this dark drama was Abud Mustafa, a mere 15-year-old who now could make his own fortune.
Og allerede som 15-årig, der begynder jeg faktisk at tilbyde det her med kørsel. Så hvis du ringede til mig, så kom jeg bare ud til dig. Så jeg kørte bare ud til folk på mine stjålne knark og leverede hash til dem. Så det var meget uskyldigt, synes jeg selv, i starten, men altså, det udviklede sig til at blive meget groft og afstumpet, ikke?
The immigrants' strong ties to Morocco also granted them direct access to hashish suppliers, eliminating middlemen and safeguarding their profits. It was a lucrative arrangement, and therefore far superior to the contacts that the Hells Angels had in the Netherlands. And with this, there suddenly was a new power factor in the Danish criminal underworld. Fearing the encroaching threat of the new gangs, the Angels sought to counteract their rising influence and power. In their quest, they reached out to other gang members, attempting to sway them into working for them, and contacted the Blackguards gang. But their attempts were not seen favorably by this immigrant gang, and they attack Ludwig, AHA member wearing the Filthy Few patch for murdering the president of Bullshit MC, was stabbed in the back by knife-wielding adversaries. This could not stand.
Blågårds plads er på det tidspunkt styret af Lille Abte. Det er ligesom om, at de har fået sådan et eller andet mantra om, at hvis du kan være hård eller smart over for en rocker, så er du virkelig noget i de kredse. Og det er vi jo før eller siden nødt til at deale med, altså i Hells Angels regi.
The conflict between the two groups now escalates, and there are several drive-by shootings from both sides, something that was new in Denmark at the time.
Hvis du var en udlænding, der gik klædt på en bestemt måde, eller bare var en udlænding, der gik i et bestemt område, så kunne du risikere at få tæsk af et tæskehold. De kørte jo ind i karavaner i områder og tæskede folk. Det halte ihjel med.
The former Hells Angels member, Jorn Junkie Nielsen, admits that some of these shootings were done by members of his own club, something he didn't like. According to him, they used to be men of honor, men who killed while looking their victim in the eye and not killing any bystanders. According to him, this is why Hells Angels' dominance has declined, and why they no longer are the dominant power in Denmark's underworld. They have lost the original honor code, and with that, their respect and dominance. Another explanation, according to Danish biker journalists, is that they are being replaced by a new, young, and hungry generation who doesn't care who the old kings are. The jackals, as Hells Angels referred to them, calling themselves lions, were now circling the former top predator, with one Danish journalist using an old Scandinavian saying,
"De er udløbet på dato,"
or their expiration date had arrived.
Others bliver etableret med det for øje, at man vil beskytte området, altså tryk, avler og modtryk, og vi er klar til at gå ligesom som de er. Hvis de vil skyde, så kan vi også skyde. Hvis de vil lave auktioner, så kan vi også lave auktioner. Men det er bare vigtigt at forstå og huske, at vi lærte det her af rockerne, fordi vi vidste ikke de her ting.
This is very similar to when the Bandidos came as an answer to the Hells Angels' dominance in the 90s. The new immigrant gangs also begin to dress with back tags and organize themselves, which they had not been very good at before. However, Hells Angels was far from defeated. They established boxing clubs in every Angel chapter, recruiting in young men, and quickly amassed a formidable force of around 100 willing recruits who dreamed of one day becoming Angels themselves. This new gang took on the name AK-81, an emblem of their readiness to answer the call, with AK meaning
altid klar.
Always ready, and 8 and A, the 8th and first letters of the alphabet, symbolized their ties to the Hells Angels. They had created a proxy gang, a shadow army that would fight in their stead while they skillfully manipulated events from the shadows. It was a cunning ploy to maintain control while avoiding a direct contact themselves. In the gritty underworld of AK-81, a new crop of young and inexperienced members eagerly sought to prove their worth for their Patreon and master, the Hells Angels. Brian Sandberg, a prominent member and the leader of the boxing clubs the Angels had started, was now targeted while at a cafe. He gets away without any serious injuries. In response to this, Hells Angels publishes their manifest on their website, calling for a war against the immigrants.
Hells Angels gik I dag til angreb på araber og muslimer ved at lægge et manifest ud, hvor de blæser til kamp mod det, som HA kalder chakaler.
Det manifest er lagt ud i pressen, fordi vi nu i et år har hørt på, at man påstår, at det her handler om narkokrig, og så tænker vi nu det nok. Og derfor har vi lagt manifestet ud, så er der ikke nogen tvivl om, hvad det er, vi er trætte af, og som jo også de fleste danskere er trætte af.
This very public announcement by Nielsen, where he says that this war is not about the drug sale, but about the increasing violence that these immigrant groups bring, hit home with some Danes.
Brian Mikkelsen, daværende justitsminister, hører chakalmanifestet, og han er så ude at udtale, at rockerne er lige så afstumpede.
The Danish Minister of Justice, Brian Mikkelsen, and another politician, didn't make the situation better when he clumsily commented the manifest in favor of Hells Angels.
Men det ændrer ikke på, at vi har ret til at forsvare os selv mod kriminelle udlænding. Når du siger sådan noget her som justitsminister, for det første siger du, men det ændrer ikke noget på, at vi, hvis du sætter dig selv i bås med HA, du har taget parti, forsvarer sig mod kriminelle udlænding. Og det her, det var guld værd for banderne.
Hells Angels had touched a nerve. The reaction from the immigrant gangs was immediate. To them, this was a declaration of war.
Vi var perkerne, vi var hadet, og HA var en organisation, som var bundkriminelle. Vi solgte kun hash nede i fucking kælder. Alligevel, så var det os, der blev de kriminaliserede og de fremmedgjorte. Det bliver meget nemt for os at rekruttere folk, fordi at I udstøder dem magt, ikke?
The recruitment to the immigrant gangs now exploded, fueling the conflict to an all-out war.
Jynke, han udfører et chakalmanifest. Det er jo måske ikke alle udlændinge, der forstår, hvad det her chakalmanifest går ud på andet end, at okay, han hader os og kalder os for chakaler. Og det er jo sådan noget der bare for mig er sådan, ja tak, det er lige hvad jeg har brug for. Ikke også? Fordi for mig er det en værdikamp, og det vil jeg gerne indrømme. For mig var det jihad på dansk jord. Altså, det var bare, okay, det er muslimer mod vantro, det her, ikke også? Det er Hells Angels, og vi er paradisets skytter og sådan der, ikke også?
But it is not just the immigrant gangs that suddenly got a lot of new recruits. Also, AK-81 and Hells Angels were being run down by young men who want to participate in this so-called race war. The manifesto has later been commented on by biker journalists as a huge PR coup because it had never before been so many that wanted to become Hells Angels and AK-81 before this. However, one of the new recruits, Martin Fried Pedersen, would eventually become the second best, or worst, informant in Hells Angels Denmark's history.
Det jeg ved, det er, at jeg på vandrørene kan høre, at HA har etableret en undergruppering af hooligans og racister og nazister og nynazister, som udelukkende har til formål at gå efter at dræbe muslimer og indvandrere. Og det er selvfølgelig totalt manipulerende, men det er i hvert fald de tanker, jeg bærer. Og på den måde så bliver vi allieret. Og så før jeg vidste af det, så var vi bare i en konflikt med de her mennesker.
The violence now increased dramatically, and in 1 week 2 people were killed and 1 wounded in a shooting. There were 18 other attempted murders that year, and 750 people were charged in an astonishing total of 910 court cases. As the writer of the manifest, Nielsen claims they later had many Danes thanking him for writing the manifest. However, not everybody did agree with Nielsen, and he is now targeted by the immigrant gangs. While out with a member of AK-81, Nielsen is attacked with a knife.
Vi lægger godt mærke til, at der kommer sådan en rød bil kørende langsomt forbi. Den stopper så, og der stiger en mand ud af den. Og så går han i gang. Og jeg bliver stukket 1 gang i hjertet, og jeg bliver snittet ned over her. Jeg bliver stukket i maven, og jeg bliver til sidst stukket i lysken. Det løber igennem mit hoved. Hvis ikke jeg får fat i den kniv, så dør vi. Men jeg får fat i den, når det lykkes os. Det slutter jo med, at jeg får kniven fra ham og stikker ham 3 gange, fordi nu har jeg fandme fået nok af ham.
When Nielsen gets the upper hand, the assailant does not impress him with his reaction.
Og så begynder han at sidde og råbe på politiet. Han skriger som stukken gris og sidder og råber på politiet, og det synes jeg er lidt sølle. Selv i det der tænker jeg, hold kæft, du kommer med en 20 cm lang kniv og vil slås. Og nu sidder du og råber på dem, du sviner til hver dag.
Shortly thereafter, Nielsen found himself back behind bars where an encounter awaited him, his first meeting with Martin Fried Pedersen. During his incarceration, Pedersen earned a reputation for wreaking havoc within his cell, adorning its walls with the graffiti AK-81, and generally causing headaches for the prison staff. In a bid to quell his disruptive behavior, the guards turned to one of Pedersen's fellow inmates for assistance, none other than Nielsen. In an ironic twist of fate, these prison guards inadvertently facilitated the recruitment of Pedersen into the ranks of the Hells Angels, a decision that would later solidify his status as one of the most notorious AK-81 members. Pedersen's deep-seated resentment towards immigrants stemmed from his tumultuous school days in a poverty-stricken neighborhood with immigrants and small gangs. Frequent clashes and bouts of violence with these groups only fueled his hostility further. As Pedersen's disdain for immigrants intensified, so did the chaos he unleashed on the streets. His first foray into serious criminal activity occurred when he participated in a drive-by shooting on a motorcycle. His plan to incinerate the bike to obliterate any evidence backfired disastrously due to his lack of experience. Drenching the motorcycle with gasoline, he failed to ensure a safe ignition, resulting in a fiery explosion. His arm ablaze and his jacket melting. He raced to the hospital, driven by excruciating pain. In his panicked haste, he neglected to ensure the bike's complete destruction, leaving behind a crucial piece of damning evidence, a lighter bearing Pedersen's DNA. The authorities wasted no time tightening their grip on Pedersen's life. They initiated a phone surveillance operation targeting him and his girlfriend. Pedersen was subsequently given a chilling task by the Angels, to shoot a man in a kiosk. Expecting the victim to be an immigrant, he was taken aback when he realized the target was a fellow white individual. Not wanting to disappoint his Patreon and masters, he closed his eyes and fired his weapon relentlessly. However, his inexperience and lack of skill ultimately saved the victim's life, but leaving him severely wounded. While fleeing, Pedersen was already haunted by guilt and remorse over what he had done.
Også det, der var tilfældet med MFP, han gik jo også rundt og havde de vildeste samvittighedskvaler over, at han havde ramt en uskyldig. Men det er jo ikke noget, man kan snakke med folk om. Du kan jo ikke gå ned i Møllerparken eller Blågårdsplads eller hvor, eller hos HA, og så begynde at begræde, at folk er blevet ramt uskyldige.
In a moment of desperate confession, he unburdened himself to his girlfriend, making a grievous and unforgivable mistake in the unforgiving world of bikers. She, in turn, shared this shocking revelation with one of her closest friends over the phone, a call monitored by the police. It triggered a sweeping wave of law enforcement actions that led to the apprehension of 30 individuals connected to both AK-81 and Hells Angels. Among them was Pedersen. Initially, Pedersen maintained a defiant silence in the face of police questioning, yet his vulnerability became a target for the authorities, who resorted to threatening the involvement of his parents and girlfriend as potential witnesses. Caught in a tightening web, Martin Fried Pedersen found himself trapped. The ominous words of the police hinted that Hell's Angels now harbored suspicions of him turning informant. Fueled by fear and a burning desire to shield his loved ones from harm, Martin made a life-altering decision. In an alliance with law enforcement, he agreed to cooperate and testify against the very organization he had, not long ago, aspired to join. The promise of safety for himself and his loved ones, coupled with anonymity in the witness protection program after serving his sentence, persuaded Martin to cooperate fully. Under the alias
Guldfuglen,
which means the golden bird signifying a bird that sings all its songs, Martin became the second most damaging witness against Hell's Angels Denmark in history after Dan Linge. Among those who faced the force of the law was Brian Sandberg, a formidable figure within the Hell's Angels. Alongside 14 other bikers, they were convicted on multiple charges, receiving a total of 112 years in prison. Martin received a 12-year sentence and today lives in the witness protection program and has no contact with his family and friends from his former life. Sandberg was sentenced to 2 years and 4 months and left Hell's Angels a few years later. With the arrest of numerous immigrant gang members, Hell's Angels and AK-81 members, the conflict gradually eased up and runs out in the sand, with the immigrant gangs now controlling the cannabis business. A total of 6 people had been killed, a 2-digit number had been wounded, and more than 1,000 people had been charged or convicted. The police strategy of cleaning the streets had worked.
Altså, hvis HA's motiv til den konflikt var at banke de etniske minoritetsgrupperinger, som ville træde ind i miljøet på plads, så har de fejlet. Og de fandme ikke vundet, fordi at det er sket det stik modsatte.
In the early days of the Hells Angels, like well before I was around, there was a brotherhood that was built on simplicity. It was built on the love of motorcycles and riding together and the brotherhood of it. And what happens in criminal organizations is pride and ego and greed get in the way of that. And the motivation changes. And pride and ego and greed will betray you, and it will leave you with nothing.
They had lost control of the lucrative cannabis business to the immigrant gangs and lost control of the underworld in big parts of Denmark to their rival Bandidos. Internal conflicts within the Angels had also degraded their dominance, and several of HA's most prominent members had been kicked out in bad standing after disagreements and power struggles internally.
Du havde en forestilling om, at du kom ind i sådan et lukket broderskab, der var helt specielt, ikke? Altså, så må jeg så sige, da jeg selv blev medlem, så krakelerede spejlet lidt, ikke? Men okay, ja.
And with an average of 2 to 3 members being kicked out every year in Denmark, many doing long prison terms, and the fact that they only accept white men as members, the Angels had trouble recruiting. Their numbers were dwindling.
Det danske rockermiljø er i begyndelsen meget homogent. Det er hvide arbejderklassemænd, som kører på motorcykel.
But a new club was now reaching Denmark, and again, similar to how the war with the Bandidos had started in Denmark, the war with Satudarah MC began because of a conflict ignited by Hell's Angels. Satudarah had no recruitment problems, since they accept members of all colors, and old Hell's Angels and Bandidos members that had been kicked out was also welcomed in, and Satudarah quickly was double the size of Hell's Angels in Denmark. A new Danish biker war would soon explode, and the Danish Hell's Angels would be in their 4th major conflict in 35 years. This is Biker History with Magnus. The conflict between the two started in Denmark when the club Verbros Hardcore, longtime friends and allies of the Angels, applied for membership in the club. The VHC's first members had made their mark in the criminal underworld for many years and were involved in the bloody conflicts with the immigrant gangs. However, VHC had members who had African origin, and this was against the international rules of the club, which in no lesser terms are expressed like this. This created a rift internally, since many members wanted to accept them after their long friendship, but it made other members reluctant. They were unwilling to break this rule of the club. This rejection turned their old friends into enemies, and made VHC apply for membership in the upcoming club Satudarah MC in 2013.
Altså selve navnet Satudarah betyder jo et blod. Alle hudfarver er velkomne.
With the new chapter in Denmark, Satudarah is soon run down by eager young men of all ethnicities who want to join, and they quickly spread out over the country.
Hvis Hells Angels havde været lidt mere omstillingsparate, som man vil sige på nudansk, og måske kunne acceptere og inkludere nogle af de her såkaldte indvandrergrupper, så er det ikke sikkert, at billedet havde set ud, som det havde været i dag. Så selve Satudarah vokser mere ud af det, man kunne kalde traditionel gadebande, end en egentlig rockerklub.
The first fight between them happened at a bar, Lions and Barrels, where there were members present from both clubs at the same time, and those who have watched my other biker videos know that this is not going to end well. In February 2014, members from the two clubs, former allies and best friends, ended up in a massive bar fight.
Jamen, jeg tror, det er nogle prøvemedlemmer, der spiller op og provokerer hinanden. De er ligesom i hver sin ende af det der festområde der, og så er der nogen, der absolut skal hen i den ende, og Satudarah. Så jeg tror faktisk, det er nogen fra HA, der starter det lidt.
And it all started with a snide comment. According to Extra Bladet, it was members of HA and AK-81 who provoked the Satudarah members by calling them a simple street gang. The brawl involved more than 30 people and started inside the bar, before moving out in the street with many regular people and families who now had to run for cover. The fight ended in a parking lot when police came and arrested the involved. There were reports of both knives being used, and that guns had been fired in this very public place, though no guns were found by the police when they searched the involved. Fortunately, no bystanders were harmed, but one of the Satudarah and two Hells Angels members were injured with stab wounds. A total of 28 people were arrested. Now, there was no turning back for either of the clubs, and the war now exploded with several violent incidences. But before we continue, let's take a quick look at Satudarah. Satudarah was founded in 1990 in the Dutch town of Moordrecht and is considered to be one of the most brutal and violent biker clubs in the world. Something they also practice against their own members who they believe have broken the rules. But keep in mind that there is a camera team present when this happened.
Hey, zo oh, man. Ja? Rustig, rustig, jongens. Rustig. Hey, nou wil ik even niks doen, jongens. Ik wil gewoon normaal praten.
The punishment for allegedly having given information to someone outside the club is losing your colors.
En liegen mag niet bij Satudarah. Haal af die jas. Wegwezen.
This member was later let back in when it turned out he hadn't talked to anybody. It was a misunderstanding internally. He later became president of one of the new chapters in Holland. But if you have killed for the club...
Dus hier sprak ik met hem af. En hier kwam hij aanlopen en terwijl ik mijn vuurwapen trok, had ik hem helemaal het magazijn leeggeschoten. Toen schoot ik hem dood. Ik heb hem in de auto laten leggen en heb ik vervolgens op een andere locatie heb ik hem gedumpt. Oh.
And done your time. You get a completely different reception and welcome back.
Neef, ik wil je welkom ons midden heten. Je bent volledig ten onrechte natuurlijk even van ons weg geweest. We zijn blij dat je er weer bent. We gaan een klein feestje vanavond bouwen.
En dus zeg maar welkom, Waren.
Laat weer! Ah! Satudarah teta!
Satudarah were the fastest growing biker club in Europe and now rivaled the Hells Angels in power and influence. They were taking over the drug trade from the Angels, along with other businesses where the Angels were heavily invested.
Die neuen Revierkämpfe von Hells Angels, Bandidos und Satudarah werden immer brutaler. Am Sonntag feuerten Unbekannte mehr als 12 Schüsse auf einen Duisburger Hells Angel ab. 4 Tage zuvor wurde in Düsseldorf ein Satudarah-Mitglied niedergestochen.
Es geht hier um knallhartes Geschäft im Drogenhandel, im Prostitutionsgewerbe und da will man eigene Marktanteile durchsetzen.
At this time, Hells Angels Denmark had just finished their third war, lost power and influence, and many internal conflicts had split the club. It was no longer the powerful club it once was. Bjorn Junkie Nielsen works as a mediator between the members who are in conflict, something that later would become his downfall in the club, and he had his hands full with domestic rivalry and power struggles.
Det galt om at finde noget at stikke hinanden i ryggen med, ikke? Og problemer og pis og lort, ikke? Altså, jeg var lige ved at sige, at der var brug for en god krig snart, ikke? Så folk de kunne fokusere på noget andet, ikke?
Det var en trussel mod hele klubben. Så jeg får jo 10 henvendelser om måneden til sidst, på om jeg gider kigge på deres sag, eller de er blevet smidt ud uretfærdigt eller et eller andet. Og det kan jeg konstatere, at de er næsten hver gang.
One of the problems for the Angels were their recruitment pool. Like many one-percenter clubs, they only accepted white males, at least at this time, and with an average of 2 to 3 members being kicked out and bad standing every year, the club's membership had stagnated. Satudarah, on the other hand, welcomed every ethnicity and did not have the same recruiting problem as Hells Angels. Quite the contrary. They were the new club in town. They were, as they say in Thailand, same but different, making them exciting and interesting for many wannabe bikers. Nielsen says that he personally didn't have any problems with having people of color as members in the club, but that this was an American rule that also applied to them. In other words, there was nothing they could do about that. Satudarah quickly amassed twice the numbers of members that the Angels had and took over many of the areas that had previously been dominated by the Angels.
Hvis du er for eksempel 250 mand i dit miljø, og du kan se, at de andre miljøer efterhånden begynder at blive flere tusind, så er man jo nødt til at tænke ud af boksen. Og det skaber jo så en åbning for, at det er bandemedlemmer, der kommer ind. Og det er ligesom den vej, man har valgt at tage nu. Det er ikke min vej. En gadebande har ingen traditioner. Den er samlet om sociale problemer om at lave kriminalitet. Det kan du ikke bygge en motorcykelfællesskab på.
But the former Brotha's member Mustafa disagrees with Nielsen and has this to say.
Jeg kender adskillige mennesker, som har indtrådt i Bandidos og i HA, som aldrig nogensinde har haft den mindste relation til en motorcykel. Nogle af dem kan ikke engang finde ud af at køre det, men så har fået den efterfølgende netop fordi det har været en eller anden slags krav for at blive optaget i de her klubber. Så for mit vedkommende har jeg aldrig nogensinde opfattet HA som værende en motorcykelklub.
In response to Satudarah, Hells Angels now begins to accept former enemies into the club, and several former Bandidos that had been left in bad standing were now welcomed in as new Angels, something that had been unthinkable shortly before.
Der er også en vis naivitet i det miljø, fordi at mange af de her døde mennesker kan vidne om, at de døde forgæves, når de så finder ud af, at deres drabsmænd fester med hans såkaldte brødre, ikke?
For a few HA members, this was hard to accept, but not much they could do about it either. This came from the leadership of the club in Denmark. And of course, it was also the other way around. Former members of Hells Angels who had been kicked out now were welcomed into Bandidos and Satudarah. Among them, Ole Ost Nielsen, who was convicted in the killing of bullshit President Hovding and a civilian, and bore the patch filthy few for this when he was an angel. He and another former HA member, Sven Holst, who I, in a former video by mistake called Ludwig, is welcomed into his new club by his former Angel's brother Ost. In 2009, Sven was involved in what has been dubbed by biker journalists as an internal cleansing, where 10 members out of nearly 20 in Aarhus were kicked out. The reason for the collective punishment was mainly disagreement about the line in the conflicts against the immigrant gangs. Check out my video for more on that. They were not among the aggressors and were seen as old-fashioned by some of the other Angels chapters. Sven now took over as leader of this chapter and was also one of the involved in what Junkie called a coup against him when he was kicked out in 2020. Sven was himself kicked out of Hells Angels 6 months later and became president of a Satudarah chapter in Denmark.
I think that it's ironic that the Hells Angels have kicked out so many people that it's given them enough ex-members that is now a force to be reckoned with.
After the first brawl at the pub and only a few days later, in a harrowing incident, 2 members of AK-81 tried to mow down a young man from Satudarah with a car in Ganlos. Miraculously, he narrowly escaped the deadly assault, rushing into the sanctuary of a nearby police station. Yet, as he made his exit later on, a police search of the vehicles arriving to fetch him unveiled a collection of axes and knives concealed within the trunk. That night descended into brutality when a car carrying 3 assailants ruthlessly struck a man. They didn't stop there. With chilling intent, they pummeled him with an iron pipe. Although the victim was familiar with several members of Satudarah, he wasn't among their ranks. The police swiftly caught up with one of the perpetrators, a man linked to Hells Angels, who soon found himself in jail in connection with the brutal assault. In a subsequent crackdown, police detained 10 individuals with ties to Satudarah. According to the police, they were hunting for members of HA and AK-81. In their cars, the police found, among other things, shovels, spikes, and an axe. Adding to the wave of violence, a Satudarah member faced a brutal attack within the confines of Horse Rod State Prison. The very HA associate previously implicated in the Ganlos hit and run was now also charged in connection with this savage prison assault. So putting him in the same prison as his enemies didn't stop him. Maybe Danish prison authorities should make a note of that. The violence escalates and several Satudarah members are arrested for extortion, drug sale, violence, and weapon smuggling. They became very visible, unlike the Angels who mostly used members of support groups to do their biddings, and in this way protect themselves from direct involvement. In the autumn of 2017, Satudarah also came into a conflict with the Bandidos, with several shooting episodes and a violent mass brawl at a boxing match in Herlev, where 2 Bandidos were injured after being attacked with knives. Later that year, the Satudarah member Kevin Joel Anderson was stabbed several times with a knife at his home in what was believed to be an internal conflict in the club. 2 men connected to Satudarah were charged with murder and for dismembering the dead body and dump it in a forest.
I augusti förra året kom en 21-årig man i Köpenhamn i kontakt med den danska polisen. Han var själv skadad och hade viktig information. Det var så polisen fick kännedom om ett bestialiskt styckmord där 21-åringen haft en huvudroll. Upptäckte polisen kroppsdelar i en skogsdunge i närheten av ett bostadsområde.
It is not something we see every day, said Prosecutor Morten Fredrickson to the newspapers. One of the accused, a 21-year-old, claimed he had been forced to dismember the body of his friend by his 34-year-old co-accused. However, they were both convicted. In 2018, an immigrant and former gang member named Nadim was shot and killed by Alexander Findanis, a prospect of Satudarah who became a fully patched member shortly after. And just like the Hells Angels have their filthy few patch, Outlaws have the SS patch, and Bandidos have their own for killing someone. So does Satudarah.
Vanavond een 1% teken uitgereikt.
Nico is gefeliciteerd. Jongens, jullie weten dat een 1% teken speciale tekens hebt bij ons in de club. Weten we allemaal. Nico heb je iets speciaals gedaan. Een daad van agressie. Er was een probleem wat Nico hardhandig de grond in heeft gedrukt. In het bijzijn van mijzelf. En vandaar dat je 1% krijgt. Dus ik vraag je traag en met eer en geweten. En gefeliciteerd.
The Danish Minister of Justice, Peter Hummelgaard, had stated in a parliamentary response that biker and gang groups must be fought with all the tools we have at our disposal. If Norway also gets their ban through, there are rumors that it could mean a de facto ban in Europe against Satudarah. Hummelgaard has tasked the Danish National Unit for Serious Crime to investigate whether there is a basis for initiating dissolution proceedings against existing biker clubs and/or gang groups in Denmark. The minister has directly named Satudarah and not Hells Angels or Bandidos yet, but if successful, Bandidos and Hells Angels will most likely be next. The war between Hells Angels and Satudarah in Denmark left only the Angels standing, while Satudarah morphed into a new club, along with many of their other European chapters. In Norway, 3 out of 4 chapters disbanded and did not take on any new colors, while the 4th in Oslo say they will continue with the same colors as before. However, since all the 9 members are in prison or awaiting prosecution, the Norwegian police consider them as unimportant in the Norwegian biker environment. But the violence and crimes that Satudarah brought with them might turn out to be all 1%er clubs' downfall in Scandinavia, depending on the outcome of these inquiries. Neither Hells Angels nor Satudarah won this war. It was again the police and the authorities that were the real winners.
Det hele starter ud med HA's indtog i Danmark. Og selvom det ikke er HA, der sidder monopolet i Danmark, hvad angår rockermiljøet, så er det alligevel dem, som har haft hele den her udforming af, hvordan den danske underverden er endt med at blive i dag. Altså, det er jo et eller andet sted HA det hele. Bare med andre navne.
Please smash that like and subscribe button as if you were a biker trying to get another member in bad standing. And please check out my other videos on this channel to see if there are others you find interesting. And I hope to see you in the next one.